Well, hey, how's it going? Welcome to my silly little videos that I like to call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that's what I talk about. If you like true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, because seriously, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't care, you should totally subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Happy July. It's already July and oh my god, it is summer. It is hot. I'm sorry if I'm red and sweating. I'm in LA, y'all, and it is clearly summertime. It's so hot in here and I can't have my fan or AC on because it's background noise. So bear with me. So today's case, all right, it's a little different, all right? We're going to be talking about a survivor of a true crime, all right? A survivor of a true crime. We will be talking today about Mary Vincent. Have y'all heard of her? Mary Vincent. I came across this story several months ago and I was completely floored. Be prepared to have your blood boil because this case is frustrating and because our country does not like to punish sexual crimes. Even though Mary Vincent survived her ordeal from this guy, there's another victim who was not as fortunate and it all could have been prevented. We'll get into it, y'all. You're gonna be floored. I was so enraged when I read about this case. Disclaimer wise, we will be talking about graphic descriptions of crime scenes in today's case. Once again, it sucks because there's so much of it in so many true crime cases, but we will be talking about sexual assault as well. So be forewarned, and let's go ahead and get into the incredible tale of Mary Vincent. So, Mary Belle Vincent. She was born May 17th, 1963, and she grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. She came from a military family. Her mother, Lucy, she was a blackjack dealer at a casino, and her father, Herbert, was a slot machine repairman. Now, Mary came from a very large family. She had 6 siblings. I know one of her sisters' name is Vanessa. I don't know the name of her other siblings, but Mary, she was one of the middle children. Now, Mary, she had aspirations of being a dancer, all right? That was her passion. And she did a lot of competitive dance. She worked front stage at the Lido di Paris in Las Vegas, and she also danced on stage in places like Hawaii and Australia. Now, when Mary was 15 years old, she ran away from home. But from what I could gather from what I read, it wasn't in the sense that she never planned to return home, but she needed to get out of that environment. I believe there was a lot of fighting going on at that time. Her parents, I was a little confused because her parents did end up divorcing, so I was a little confused at this time when she ran away. I know her parents were fighting a lot, and I don't know if they were going through a divorce or starting a divorce, but it was just kind of a tumultuous time in the household, so there was a lot of fighting between Lucy and Herbert. And Mary was also described as being in her rebellious teenage phase, all right? And honestly, from what I read, it was sort of like that typical teenage stuff, you know? She was cutting school, playing hooky, staying out past curfew, wearing makeup and clothes that her mother didn't approve of. Honestly, it sounded kind of like basic, teenage rebellious stuff. So Mary, in the summer of 1978, she ran away from home. And she said she ran away after one of her sisters told her she had, quote, better run, because her father, Herbert, was on his way home, had one of his traditional migraines, and was looking for her. She was in trouble. Mary would later say, quote, I left home to save my life. It wasn't to seek wild times. I didn't know anything about the world or the opposite sex. On the road, run away from home, Mary slept in the streets. She would spend nights behind garbage cans and dumpsters. She would find unlocked cars on the street and spend the night in there. At one point, she lived with a 26-year-old boyfriend in their car. I know, she was 15 with a 26-year-old, I know. But they were staying in a car together in Sausalito, California, when her boyfriend was charged with sexual assault of a high school girl. And this was from something that had occurred in August of 1978. So he was hauled away, and so Mary was on her own. Now, at this point, she was really unsure of what to do. do, how to support herself. She was really lost because this boyfriend was sort of who she relied on for everything. What a shock, a 26-year-old with a 15-year-old, and she relies on him for everything. Now, for some time, Mary did stay with an uncle, and this was in Soquel, California. So she stayed with him for a little bit, and then on the morning of September 29th, 1978, Mary left her uncle's home, and she had planned to travel the 400 miles to Southern California to see a grandfather who lived in Corona. She planned to hitchhike. Remember, guys, this is the late 70s, and hitchhiking was very commonplace. She left her uncle's house in a pink top, blue jeans, white tennis shoes, and carried her green backpack and reddish-purple knit purse. She hitched a ride to San Rafael, and there she was picked up by a man who ended up dropping her off somewhere in Vallejo. I almost had trouble saying that. Vallejo. And this guy gave Mary directions on how to get to LA. She was then picked up by a woman who was traveling with 2 men and a dog, and they dropped her off in Berkeley, California. Now, in Berkeley, Mary, along with 2 other hitchhikers, they were on this corner, I believe it was near UC Berkeley. It was a pretty popular corner where hitchhikers were very commonplace. So Mary is there with 2 other hitchhikers. I believe they were 2 males, and they're sitting there, trying to catch a ride, when an older, middle-aged man with a large red bulbous nose pulled up. He was in a blue Ford Econoline van and was wearing a blue jumpsuit. This man was 50-year-old merchant seaman Lawrence Larry Bernard Singleton. And Larry here, he looks like a grandpa. He looked like an elderly grandpa. He stopped by the hitchhikers, opened his van, and said that he would give them a ride, but only one of them. He only had room for one of the hitchhikers, which was kind of odd because when the door to his van was open, his back seat was pretty clear and open. There wasn't a lot of stuff, and it's a van, so he easily could have picked all 3 of them up. But he said he could only pick one of them up, and it was Mary who got the ride. Let's get into a little bit of Larry. Larry was born July 28th, 1927 in Tampa, Florida. He was the son of a railroad worker, and he also came from a pretty large family. He was one of 8 children. He had 2 sisters and 5 brothers. In 1944, Larry dropped out of Hillsborough High School, and he trained as a merchant seaman. He later joined the U.S. Army, and he did serve in the Korean War. He had served with distinction as an infantryman, and according to friends, he had literally participated in the infamous bloody battle that took place on Pork Chop Hill. And this was an experience he rarely, if ever, spoke about. In the 1960s, Larry worked on merchant ships off the coast of Vietnam, and he was working on ships for the Coast Guard. And around this time is when he married his first wife, a woman named Shirley. Could not find a last name for her. And the couple ended up having a daughter together, a daughter they named Deborah. Larry and Shirley ended up divorced. I'm not quite sure when, and Shirley would end up dying of cancer in 1976. Approximately 1976. I couldn't find an exact date, but it was around that time. Larry ended up settling in New Orleans, and from there, he would set out to different ports all across the world. Like many of his peers, Larry would wait in the Seamen's Union Hall. At this Union Hall, he would wait to receive notifications from shippers from all over who needed a crew, and Larry would immediately sign up and go and be shipped off all over. He ended up moving to the West Coast in 1968, and he specifically moved to the Bay Area in Northern California. And here, he took a job with the American President Cruise Lines. And this was based out of Oakland, and it was while working this job aboard the President Wilson, where Larry would meet his second wife, a woman named Mary Collins. And this was around 1970. On the President Wilson, Larry was the ship's navigator, and Mary was the ship's nurse. But the second marriage wouldn't last. Larry's job apparently had him stationed out of New Orleans at some point, while Mary stayed behind on the West Coast, so I'm assuming they got different assignments after they were done on the President Wilson. So that didn't help, but Mary said the real reason their marriage broke apart was due to Larry's drinking. He was an alcoholic. She also noted that Larry, while he was pretty mild-mannered and docile when he was sober, when he was drunk, he was violent. Yeah, he was a violent drunk. And after only 2 years of marriage, the couple divorced, though Mary and Larry would remain a close friendship. Now, eventually, Larry received his master's license. And this was a license to pilot tankers and cargo ships. And he earned this license in San Francisco in 1974. Now, to get this license is apparently like a pretty big deal, and you have to go through like a lot of training. And he had taken his formal training at the Maritime Institute of Technology and graduate studies in Baltimore. And he had graduated from there with his captain's license, or excuse me, his captain's certificate. And this enabled him to command any U.S. merchant marine ship on the high seas. And it included a wide variety of ships, including a 200-ton oil tanker or the Queen Elizabeth II cruise ship. He was described as like a prodigy when it came to ships and boating. And he was known as a, quote, unlimited master, which I guess is the highest ranking the Coast Guard can bestow upon a sailor. In order to get this rating, a sailor has to have years and years of experience sailing. And not just that, you have to also pass a whole series of exams that take 4 days to complete. And apparently this like title, rank, whatever of unlimited master, it's not something that like everyone gets. It's a pretty big deal. Larry was proficient in the rules of the sea, navigation, techniques of ship operations, and radar equipment. And he knew really precise techniques such as how to balance the oil in a tanker so that the ship doesn't list. Like I said, Larry was an alcoholic. He was a very, very heavy drinker. And apparently that's like something super common with sailors, I guess. I don't know if that's still true, but at least during this time when Larry was a sailor, apparently it was pretty common for sailors to have a bit of a drinking problem. Larry had also gotten to some scrapes with the law. He had a prior conviction for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, drunk driving, and public drunkenness. Though when it came to his work record, it was spotless. It seemed that he did not drink on the job, and he did not work while drunk. And this was despite the fact that his job had him working 7 days a week for months and months at a time. Apparently during that time when he was working, he was not drinking. And yeah, like with a lot of alcoholics, Larry was described as having a very mild-mannered temper when he was sober, but when he got drunk is when he got violent. And actually, the beginning of that summer of 1978, he had actually gotten into a really bad fight with his daughter, Deborah, who was 15 years old at the time, so around Mary's age. Apparently, the two argued about like this home ownership over a home that was in the Bay Area that his first wife, Shirley, Deborah's mother, had. And it was still in her mother's name. And yeah, they were arguing, I think, about like the ownership of the house or something. And they got into a pretty bad argument. And it got so bad that 15-year-old Deborah was actually sent to the hospital. She had injuries to her face. And she ended up filing a legal complaint against her father, complaining that he drank too much, was violent, and she requested permission to go live with some friends until she became of legal age. And the court granted her request. So yeah, Larry may seem like a prodigy when it came to sailing and all that, but in his real life, he kind of seems like a D-bag. According to Larry's second wife, Mary, she said that after this whole incident with his daughter, Deborah, she said Larry, quote, just didn't seem to find any sense in living after this. His second wife, Mary, she painted a different story of Larry, or a different picture of Larry, I should say. She said he was very devoted to his first wife, absolutely adored his daughter, and she claimed that Larry actually doted on Deborah and like spoiled her rotten. She claimed that Larry had bought Deborah a new Ford Thunderbird as her 16th birthday present, and he also bought her 2 ponies. And it's like, well, yeah, but like physical gifts and presents, that doesn't make up for physical abuse. And honestly, that's kind of a pattern with abusers, right? Is they abuse and then they apologize and try to, right, like win back favor. Now, I read sources that said when Larry picked Mary Vincent, hitchhiking in Berkeley, that at this time, he had virtually no contact with his daughter. And it is said Deborah absolutely despised him at this point. So Larry picks up 15-year-old Mary Vincent in Berkeley, and he told her that he was going to Reno, Nevada, but he would take a detour to take her to LA. And so Mary got into Larry's blue van, and they took off. When she got in the van, she promptly lit a cigarette, and it caused her... I dropped my brush again. Good Lord. So when Mary first got into the van and they took off, she promptly lit a cigarette. And because she's like a 15-year-old, she coughed. And it's at this point that Larry, I guess, reached behind her neck with his hand and said, quote, "Let's see if you're sick." And Mary immediately jerked away and was annoyed at being hit on so soon. She's like, "Really, dude? Like, you literally just picked me up mere minutes ago and you're already hitting on me." And she backed up against the passenger door out of his reach. But even after this encounter, Mary continued her ride with Larry, and he told her that he needed to stop by his house in San Francisco to pick up some laundry before they head out of town. And Mary agreed to help him tote his laundry baskets from his house to the back of the van. And as soon as they did that and were on the road again, Larry started drinking some unknown liquor from a milk carton while driving. So the two chatted for a little bit. Larry talked about how he had a second home in Nevada and told Mary a little bit about his life. And eventually, Mary dozed off and fell asleep. And when Mary woke up, she noticed that the road signs and freeway signs they were passing were not showing that they were, in fact, heading towards Los Angeles. They were headed somewhere else. They were actually headed towards Nevada, not LA. And this, rightfully so, Mary's very angered. So she reaches around the back of her seat to try to feel for something. She was trying to feel around for some sort of weapon, and she felt this, long, jagged stick. I read sources that said it was a surveyor's stick, and she grabbed it and then brandished it at Larry and demanded that he take her to LA and turn around immediately. She told Larry that she could take care of herself and that, he better turn around. Now, surprisingly, Larry did as he was told. Now, I did read another source that said when Mary brandished the surveyor's stick at him and demanded that he turn around, he pulled over, tried to force her into the back, but she had she had the surveyor's stick, and so she whacked him several times with it. He then said that he had made an honest mistake, and he wasn't going to hurt her. So a little confused. There was some, little minor details, so I don't know if she just brandished the stick at him and was like, "Yo, you better turn around," and so he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just a befuddled old man," and turned around, or if he actually did pull over, attempt to put her in the back seat, but she whacked him with a stick. Those were just the stories those were just the versions that I read. There were two different versions that I read. It's always so interesting in some of these cases that you can't get the exact same details. So I guess they drove a little while, I'm going to assume in the correct direction. And at some point they pulled over at a Greasy Spoon diner, and this was in the Sacramento area. And the two ate there before they continued on. At the restaurant, Larry had ordered a soda, but when they left, he poured out a majority of the soda and poured some whiskey in the cup. And again, drank as he drove. Now, around sunset, Larry pulled off the freeway and followed a deserted road down Del Puerto Canyon. And he told Mary that he had to go to the bathroom, really bad, and he couldn't wait till the next rest stop or until they came to a restaurant or something. So he pulled over. He's on this deserted desert road, and he pulls over and gets out, and Mary gets out of the van as well. Now, I read some sources that Mary used the bathroom as well, while others said that she just got out of the van to stretch her legs. And yet another source said that she actually got out of the van to scope out the area because she was thinking that she was gonna have to, take off really quick. So she was surveying the area. So not sure what exactly she did when she got out of the van, but we do know that when she was out of the van, she bent over to tie her shoe because it had come untied. And the next second, Mary knew a crushing blow landed on her back. A second blow landed in the back of her head. Now, I read one source that said Larry had hit her with a hammer, and a few other sources said that it was with a sledgehammer, and yet other sources said that he had hit her with her fists. Again, I'm not sure why there isn't consistent details, but that was just what I read. So I'm not sure if he hit her with a weapon or just his fists, but he did hit her. And with one hand, because Larry's much bigger and Mary's only 15 years old. And with one hand, Larry opened the door of his van, pushed Mary inside, told her not to scream or he would kill her. And within seconds, he had Mary's hands tied behind her back. He ripped open her blouse and had her on the floor of the van. And I'm about to get a little graphic here, guys. He then forced Mary to perform oral sex on him, and he said, quote, "You better suck hard, bitch." And he then sexually assaulted 15-year-old Mary. When it was all over, Larry heaved himself back behind the wheel of his van, stark naked and drove a few more miles down the deserted canyon road. He then stopped and pulled over again, went back to Mary, cut her hands loose, and told her that he would set her free, but only if she did everything that he told her. He then handed her a cup of liquor and forced her to down it, and he then sexually assaulted her a second time. And other sources I said that he actually assaulted and sodomized her numerous times, while choking her, by the way. And apparently Mary begged him several times to just let her go, to set her free. And the liquor, plus, the trauma and everything that was going on to poor Mary, she ended up blacking out / passing out. I read other sources that said that she passed out due to Larry choking her. Now, when Mary came to, Larry told her to get out of the van and lie on the edge of the road. And she did as she was told, terrified, naked, traumatized. I read another few sources that said when Mary had passed out, Larry thought that he had killed her. So he drove further down the road, picked up her body, draped it over his shoulder, carried her out of the van, and that's when Mary started coming to and groaning, and then he placed her on the side of the road. So yeah, again, really weird that there's not consistency, but yeah, I read a couple sources that said that he told her to get out of the van and lie on the road, and then other sources that said that he, physically picked her up and laid her on the side of the road. But either way, when she's lying on the side of the road, naked and terrified, she heard Larry rustling around in the back of his van. And he came back. Y'all, just be prepared for this next part. So he came back, grabbed her left hand, and said, quote, "You want to be free? I'll set you free." And he chopped off Mary's left arm right below the elbow, and he chopped it off with the axe 3 times. I read other sources that said he had used a machete, while other sources said that it was a hatchet. So not exactly sure on the type of weapon he used, but he hacked off her left arms, guys. Hacked it off. And then he immediately chopped off her right arm, this time in 5 swings. Mary would later say of the attack, quote, "He took my left arm and took 1 swing, and I started to fall. And then he took another swing, and I grabbed his arm, grabbed it real tight, and I couldn't figure out holding him real tight on his arm, but I'm still falling." Can you imagine? I was so horrified when I read that, guys. Can you imagine? Dear God, I have a very vivid imagination, and it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about it, because I read a book about this case, which, I'll plug at the end. But my God, when I was reading sources, articles and the book, my God, I could not even imagine. Now, Mary, of course, because she's conscious, fully aware when this is happening, screams bloody murder. She would later tell people that the pain was so intense that she thought it would be better if she could just throw up and die right there. Bleeding profusely and in enormous pain and shock, Larry then shoved Mary down a 30-foot embankment and stuffed her into a concrete pipe. I read other sources that described it specifically as a culvert, and he violently stuffed her in there. He collected her hacked off arms and then drove off, heading back home to Northern California in the Bay Area. He drove to the lower decks of the Oakland Bay Bridge and tossed Mary's arm over the bridge. One of her arms would wash away forever, never to be recovered, while the other got carried into an estuary where it eventually washed up on rocks and was found. Now, Larry thought he had made it difficult, if not nearly impossible, to identify Mary, because remember, this was the 70s, so it was primarily fingerprints, right? And so he figured hacking off her arms and then taking them and tossing them off the bridge would prevent anyone from identifying her. And he then went home successfully thinking that he had killed Mary. But Mary didn't die, guys. She didn't die after getting her arms hacked off, being thrown down an embankment, and then shoved into a frickin' pipe. She did not die. Isn't that incredible? I'm so in awe of this woman. The more research I did on her, dear God, because I can tell you right now, I don't think I could survive that. I don't think I'm that strong. Mary fought the urge to go to sleep, attempted to crawl out of the pipe, but ended up slipping in the thick caked on mud and dirt that was like all lining in the pipe. And then she promptly passed out. And when she awoke, the remainder of her arms had dried with the caked on like mud onto them. And so she packed even more mud onto the wounds. And this was to help stem the blood loss. Like, isn't that brilliant? I don't know if I would even like think of that, like, dear God. But yeah, she saw that the mud had sort of like dried and caked on. And so she slapped some more mud and dirt on her arms to try to stem the blood loss. And with some difficulty, she did manage to crawl out of the culvert, crawl up that 30-foot embankment. She has no arms, guys. She had, like, I am so floored by this case. Every detail that I saw was like, dear God. So she manages to crawl up that 30-foot embankment and starts walking down the road naked. Remember, she's stark naked as well and injured. The sun was already rising and the temperatures were already rising into the 80s. Mary said that she felt there was like a presence with her that wanted her to survive. And she said that she also thought in her mind, like, you know what? This guy is going to do this to someone else. I gotta stop him. Like, they might not survive. And she said these were like the thoughts and feelings that were keeping her going, just keeping her putting one foot in front of the other. These were just the thoughts that she was focusing on. So as she's walking down the road in the morning, we're now in September 30th, Mary's walking down. Again, she's naked and she's also holding her arms up to slow the blood loss and to prevent her muscles from slipping out. So she was walking in 80-degree weather, stark naked, down a deserted canyon road with the stumps of her arms lifted above her head so her muscles wouldn't slip out. Just incredible, incredible, man. And she was eventually found and picked up by a couple of women who had missed their freeway exit. I read other sources that said it was a couple, like a man and a woman who had missed their freeway exit, but regardless, she was picked up by two people. Mary had ended up walking 3 miles like that before those people came upon her. Actually, a car of young men in a convertible had driven past her first, but as they got closer, they got scared and just drove off. What pieces of garbage. Thankfully, the two people who decided to stop and actually help a human being in suffering rather than take off, they ended up getting her to a hospital, and her story soon made headlines all over the nation. I mean, guys, I just told you how she survived. How could that not be a compelling story, you know? I can't believe I had never heard of this story before I had just kind of like stumbled onto it on my own. This should be a story that everyone knows. Incredible, right? She's 15 years old. The press ended up dubbing her not yet known assailant the Mad Chopper. I swear. Media and their silly little names. Mary was given the pseudonym Maria in press to protect her identity, because remember, she is a minor. And yeah, the hunt was on. Meanwhile, after stopping at his house in the Bay Area, Larry had hightailed it to Sparks, Nevada. And apparently when he got here, he attempted suicide. And this was about a week after he had left Mary for dead. He had combined scotch with some barbiturates, but he instead ended up in the hospital for 4 days. Now, Mary, meanwhile, after she had been hospitalized for 10 days, she was able to describe to the police her attack. She described and repeated everything that Larry had told her about his life, what he looked like, what his house looked like in San Francisco or in the Bay Area that they stopped by. She couldn't remember, where she had been picked up from him in Berkeley, but all the other details were pretty stark. She was able to describe, everything that Larry said about his life, what his house looked like, even though she didn't know exactly where it was. She identified, the front yard, what it looked like, and she was able to describe Larry to a T, and so a composite sketch was made. Mary was even put under hypnosis in order to get her to remember her exact route that she had taken that day, because, dudes, she's been shocked and traumatized and mutilated. Yeah, it's gonna be a little difficult for her to remember every little thing she had done that day, you know? I mean, shoot, I have a hard time remembering what I did yesterday. Now, with the composite sketch, detectives then combed through the Bay Area, showing the sketch to anyone and everyone, and of course, disseminating it to all of the news stations. And this composite sketch would turn out to give them their big break. So this composite sketch that Mary had been able to describe to the composite artist, the composite sketch was such a dead ringer for Larry that one of his former neighbors recognized him. This neighbor, her name was Joanne Eversole, and after seeing a report of the story, she called police and was like, hey, that kind of looks like my former neighbor, Larry Singleton. She had actually waited 2 days from the time that she saw the news report until she called the police, because she wanted to make like absolute sure. Like she really had to sit on it. And I think a lot of us would be like that. Like, who would think that they would know a murderer, assaulter, mutilator? You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of us would have that feeling, right? Because that's just how we are. Even those of us in the true crime community, right? Like, we read about these cases and we know that it could happen to everyone, but there's still that little piece of some people that are like, but it'll never happen to me. It'll never happen to anyone, like, around me or in my sphere. You know what I mean? So Joanne is sitting there contemplating it, but finally, after 2 days, she called the police and let them know, like, yeah, that does kind of look like my neighbor, former neighbor. She told police her old address where she had lived next to Larry. She said that he did have a blue Econoline van, and she also informed them that he had a second property in Sparks, Nevada, on top of telling the police that he was a former merchant seaman. And police, of course, swarmed both of his properties, both in the Bay Area and in Sparks. And in the Bay Area home, police found Mary's clothes in the fireplace. They were charred and burnt. And in Sparks is where Larry was arrested, and he was arrested on October 9th. And I did read other reports that the second home in Sparks actually technically, and I think legally, belonged to a second wife, but he was staying there or something. And neighbors in Sparks were absolutely shocked. They were like jaw on the ground shocked. You know, they thought he was like this sweet, quiet old guy. I mean, he looks like an old grandpa. And they just thought this was just this sweet old man who loved to macrame plant hangers. And, you know, I mentioned before, Larry did have past brushes with the law, but that was mainly having to do with alcohol. There was nothing in his past that involved sexual assault or violence of any kind. So it just floored people. They were completely shocked. Now, when Larry was interrogated by police, he recounted his day. Now, that day is September 29th. So he said that he stopped and had lunch at 2:30 p.m. in Berkeley, and he had plans to head home to Sparks. And that is when he came across Mary hitchhiking. He picked her up, offered her $5, and this was to help him move his laundry, and so they did. And afterwards, Larry said that he and Mary headed towards Sparks. And Mary told him that she actually had relatives in Reno. They stopped for gas in Auburn, and when they got back on the road, this is when Larry claims that Mary brandished and hit him with the surveyor's stick, which he didn't know where it came from, by the way. Larry said Mary was a hard-bitten runaway who smoked, quote, reefer, and threatened to maim him and accuse him of sexual assault if he didn't take her to LA. Larry said that under the threat of Mary, he started driving. At some point, they stopped at an A&W restaurant. They ate there, and then when they were back on the road, they spotted 2 male hitchhikers, and Mary made him pull over and pick them up. He said one hitchhiker was a blonde, weather-beaten man, and he had a beard, and his name just happened to be Larry as well. The other was a Mexican man named Pedro. Larry then claimed that hitchhiker Larry, all right, busted out some, quote, reefer, and the 3 of them, so hitchhiker Larry, Pedro, and Mary, they smoked it while Larry drove them. Now, Larry's story is just very rambling and incoherent and full of plot holes. He said at one point, like, they had stopped by, like, an old abandoned shack, and that the men and Mary broke into it, but he said that he couldn't really remember that part. Now, Larry said that he was worried he was going to take the rap for this, because in the past, he had picked up some teenage hitchhikers, and that he had, quote, passed out in his van, and the teenagers drove it, and when he woke up, his van was in front of a bar, and he was then charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Yeah, okay. He then said that Mary had sex with the men in his van. Well, not Pedro, because according to Larry, Mary allegedly called him a, quote, fat Mexican. Yeah. Now he's trying to paint Mary as a racist. He also referred to Mary as a, quote, $10 whore. Larry said that Mary had sex with him too, then Hitchhiker Larry, and then they stopped by the shack, which Larry couldn't even remember. Couldn't remember any details about that. And then they all drove off. This time, Pedro was driving the van, and Mary was nude and sitting in the front seat with Hitchhiker Larry. He then said that he fell asleep and passed out in the back of his van. And when he came to, it was Hitchhiker Larry and Pedro in the front of his van, Pedro driving, and there was no Mary. And he assumed that they were the ones who had mutilated and attempted to kill Mary. Yeah, this was his story that he was telling the cops, guys. Like, yeah, and if you're having a difficult time kind of following Larry's rambling story here, yeah, it's because it's utter bull. Now, it didn't take detectives long to start poking many holes in Larry's tale here. First of all, like with most liars in interrogation, right? His story kept changing. He kept changing little details here and there. And he stumbled over seemingly simple details that anyone should have been able to recall if this story was true. And he said, authorities said that he started, like, visibly sweating profusely when detectives pressed Larry on why he had washed his van from top to bottom. This was the day that he had got back home after he had tossed Mary's arms over the bridge. He cleaned out his van very thoroughly and even had washed the rugs and the floor mats inside, along with the blue jumpsuit that he was wearing when he picked Mary up. And they were like, that's kind of a weird coincidence. You certainly did, like, quite a deep clean there, Larry. Deborah informed detectives that her father acted strange when he got into sparks, that he was drinking even more than usual, and she said that it seemed like he was, like, emotionally upset. So I'm not sure how Deborah was able to explain to police Larry's emotional state or mental state, since I also read reports that said when he had picked up Mary, him and Deborah were sort of estranged, but maybe she saw him occasionally or something. Now, Larry, though, he still denied everything. He said that he was innocent, he hadn't done anything to Mary at all, and in the days after his arrest, Larry did a little interview with an article, and he said that he had tried to search his conscience, quote, thinking that, possibly, I was guilty of this heinous crime. Yeah, now Larry was saying that he didn't remember anything at all. So, what's up, Larry? There's no two hitchhikers now? Now all of a sudden, he just has amnesia. He told People magazine that he felt, quote, revulsion when he considered that he may have attacked Mary, and that he may have attacked her in an alcoholic haze. He said he was also cowed by Mary's threat, her threat to accuse him of sexual assault if he didn't drive her to LA. He said, quote, I was afraid of the charge. I wondered, did this trigger violence in me? Oh, please. 6 months after Mary was released from the hospital, she had to appear in court because Larry was on trial. His charges were forcible sodomy, forced oral copulation, kidnapping, mayhem, and torture. And his trial took place in March of 1979. His trial took 2 weeks and took place in San Diego. And this was after being moved from Northern California due to pretrial publicity. So it was moved all the way down to Southern California and San Diego. Mary testified in court, identifying Larry and recounting what happened. When asked to describe the assault, she said, quote, I heard it. Now, get this, guys. Your blood's gonna boil. Your blood's gonna boil. If it hasn't already. This was a 15-year-old who was mutilated. So, though Larry was found guilty of all charges, due to the lax, lenient sentences that we have for sexual crimes, you want to know what Larry was sentenced to? You want to know? Keep in mind everything that I just said that he did to Mary. He was sentenced to 14 years. 14 years. And this was the maximum that the law would allow. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna lie. I get very triggered when it comes to sexual crimes. Even today, we do not punish sexual crimes nearly enough. We punish marijuana users and dealers more than sexual crimes, and it's disgusting. I'm sorry, I'm a little worked up with this case. Like, it makes my blood boil. Yeah, 14 years for what he did to Mary. Mary said that on her way out of the courtroom, after she had testified, she had to walk out of the courtroom, and she actually had to walk within inches. Like, she had to pass Larry, and she was, like, within inches of him. And he said to her, quote, if it's the last thing I do, I will finish finish the job. Larry was then sent to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mary's life after this incident, all right? So in the years following the trial and conviction, Mary's family splintered. Living in Las Vegas, Herb and Lucy sent Mary to a school for the disabled, for the physically disabled, and she also began seeing a psychiatrist. Although I did read another source that said Mary actually never returned to school after the attack. So I'm not sure. I was a little confused on that. One said that she was actually sent to a school for the physically disabled, while another said that she actually never returned to school after. According to Mary, her parents were not really much help after this. They were much too consumed with their own feelings about what had happened to their daughter. And they were more concerned about how they were going to deal with it than, their daughter who has to actually live with it. And as her therapy started bringing up unpleasant memories, according to Lucy, Mary's mother, Mary, quote, got wild again. And what exactly does that mean, Lucy? Staying out late, putting on makeup, typical teenage stuff? Mary's father, Herb, started collecting guns and started fantasizing and theorizing how he could kill Larry. Don't really blame him. I'm a little unclear as to when, but I said this earlier, Mary's parents did end up divorcing. Herb ended up moving to Alaska, while Lucy stayed in Las Vegas. Mary's siblings ended up scattered all throughout Nevada and the Northwest. And after she graduated high school, again, assuming she went back to school, Mary stayed in Las Vegas, and she struggled, all right? She struggled with her isolation, her loneliness, and depression. Mary said that she had made new friends, as her old friends either didn't know how to act around her because she was so uncomfortable, or they hated her. Hated her! How do you hate someone for what happened to them? I don't understand that. But yeah, that's what Mary said. Mary said that she felt like a public spectacle, and people would just always refer to her as, quote, the girl who had that accident. Man, you think we deal with ableism today. Can you imagine what Mary had to deal with? Mary said that she felt aimless for a while, and she did try to speak in public schools, trying to warn kids about the dangers of hitchhiking, but she said she eventually had to stop doing it because she was just getting rude comments from a-hole kids and D-bag kids and teenagers who just didn't take it seriously and just had that attitude of yeah, man, that ain't gonna happen to me. I know, what little turds. And so she said for her own mental health, she had to stop doing that. Mary said that joining victims groups didn't help her, at all. Didn't help her. No one recognized that she was, bottling things up and not really dealing with her emotions and what really happened to her. And so people would actually tell her there was nothing wrong with her. This makes me so rageful on her behalf. Can you imagine? There's nothing wrong with you. Yeah, you were only just traumatized, violated, and mutilated by some disgusting old fart. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. Give me a break. That I couldn't, read the articles that Mary has done interviews where she talks about how she tried to go to, these victims groups and therapists and stuff, and, her experience, dude, oh my God. She said psychologists were actually telling her, it's actually harder for your parents to deal with what happened to you than you yourself. I feel I'm nuts or something when I read that. I was like, what? What? Harder for her parents? Excuse me. She's the one that has to live with this, all right? Not them. God, I hope to God that kind of attitude is still not prevalent in those spaces. Dear Lord. She said that no one knew how to deal with someone like her. And she said after a while, she stopped going to therapists, stopped going to psychologists, stopped going to victim groups, victim support groups. Because, yeah, they just weren't helping her. And so she just kind of floated aimlessly. She, of course, couldn't find work and couldn't even afford to fix her prosthetics. Her medical bills amounted to the tens of thousands of dollars because, yeah, here in America, we have medical bills. I know they have medical bills in other wares too, but tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills. Now, California actually had a state program to help victims of crimes, of specifically violent crimes. But the problem was that Mary was a resident of Nevada. Because she was a minor, they deferred to her parents' address, and they lived in Nevada. However, because because this, case had some publicity, the state of California didn't want to look bad. That'd be like some pretty bad optics. And so they ended up allowing Mary to participate in the program. She only ended up receiving a measly $13,000, which came nowhere close to settling her medical bills, let alone fixing her prosthetics. And only $300 was donated by citizens. Although $6,000 would be collected through a public fund that was set up in her name. And for the next 10 years after the attack, Mary's only sources of income was the money from the state program, money from the public fund, and public assistance. But despite this, in 1995, Mary had to file for bankruptcy. Sorry, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sorry. Like, she should be taking care of the rest of her life. It's exactly the kind of thing I want my tax dollars going for, So yeah, she had to file bankruptcy, and this was despite winning a $2.56 million civil suit against Larry. But even though she had won, Larry revealed in court that he had no way to pay. He was unemployed, in poor health, and he only had $200 in savings at the time. So yeah, even though she had won that settlement, can't get blood from a stone, right? Mary ended up in Gig Harbor, Washington, and it seems like this was the place that she was able to set down some roots, somewhat. And it should come as no surprise that Mary definitely struggled with her relationship with men after this. She said afterwards that she didn't think too highly of them anymore. And I don't blame her. Mary ended up having a son named Luke, and she talked about Luke's father, who was a boss of like a landscaping company or like a landscaping team. She had married Luke's father in 1988, but the marriage didn't last more than 3 years. And she explained how, he just didn't understand her. She said, quote, "He is like other people who want to care about somebody who went through a bad trauma. They can't cope with the hurt that goes on inside me or any other victim." So I know for a while, Mary lived in an anonymous place in Washington. I was a little confused if that was Gig Harbor and that was revealed later. But when she did end up in Washington, it was in an unknown location. And there she was able to find some kind of peace. Nobody in that town knew who Mary was or how she had lost her arms. Many people just assumed she had been born like that. And she said that it just made it easier. And public records, such as her driver's license, her marriage licenses and stuff, stuff that are usually open to public record, they were sealed for Mary. So that's why the town that she moved to in Washington was kept secret. Again, I was a little confused if that town did ended up being Gig Harbor or if she ended up there later. I was a little confused about that because, yeah, they tried to seal her public records and where she was so she could try to live her life. Now, it took several years for Mary to speak publicly about her ordeal, and she first started speaking out in the late 80s, and when she did first start speaking out, she was petrified that the town she lived in was going to be revealed. Unsurprisingly, she struggled with anxiety. She was very timid and skittish. She smoked constantly, always seemed to be on the brink of tears. And I know her sister Vanessa was constantly at her side. She would refer to what happened to her as, quote, the accident, and would refer to Larry not by name, but as, quote, Mr. Wrong. She said that when she had her first son, Luke, that he gave her a reason to live. Her landlady helped Mary with her day-to-day tasks and taking care of Luke. And yeah, when she started talking out, she started talking about not just the incident, what happened to her, but her life afterwards, her healing, the physical healing. So she had prosthetics for both of her arms, obviously. And she talked about how painful it was to learn to function without her limbs, her normal limbs. She said, quote, "I wanted to totally give up, but whenever I said, I can't do it, I won't do it, and I don't want to, a very stubborn hospital therapist would say, you can, you will, and you must." She described how sometimes it took her 2 hours just to get herself together in the morning because she would just get so frustrated and then she would just break down and cry. I just can't imagine. I'm trying to not tear up just talking about this because dear God, no one should have to go through this. And what she had to go through, it pisses me off. Mary's hopes of dancing were apparently completely dashed. I guess she just couldn't move the way that she did before. And for the reconstructive surgery, I guess they had to take parts of her leg to I don't know, go to parts of her arm. So I don't know if we're talking skin graft or something like that. But yeah, after her reconstructive reconstructive surgery, she just like couldn't move the way she did before. And so her lifelong dream and passion of dancing was completely taken away by a disgusting POS. So after 10 years of having her prosthetics, remember I said that she started speaking out in the late 80s, so that was approximately 10 years, after having her prosthetics, she had learned to function normally with them. Now, her prosthetics were like the cheaper kind with like metal fingers that like moved stiffly, and they only moved in one direction, and they didn't move like side to side or anything like that. But get this. This is how amazing this woman is, guys. Using spare parts from like broken down refrigerators, like old stereos, like stereo systems specifically, like stuff like that. She modified her prosthetics to where like her fingers could move in all directions. So she had like much greater like range of movement. She said, quote, "There's all this stuff in the world that's been discarded. If you keep working with it, it'll work with you." She shot pool like really well, guys. Like she was saying like her friends refused to ever play pool with her because she ended up being really good. She ended up being really good at bowling. Ended up like, I guess like creating like a unique like prosthetic for like her like bowling so she could like throw the ball. Pretty amazing stuff. She wrote, and she also discovered an unknown talent that she had. She could now draw. Mary said, right, one night when she couldn't sleep, she got out of bed and she drew a face. And within an hour, a fully developed face was staring back at her. Now, before this, Mary said that she couldn't even draw a straight line, even with a ruler. She said that this talent was something that had awoken in her after the attack. And her art was something that gave her self-esteem and helped her heal in ways that other sources just couldn't. She used chalk pastels, and her art often portrays powerful women as female action figures. Some are scantily clad, others are fully clothed, but they're all self-assured and like self-assured poses and stuff and ready to fight. I read an article that described her art as, quote, "working in the vein of Alberto Vargas's pinups with the decorative intensity of Maxfield Parrish." And like I said, how Mary learned to improve her prosthetics by like tinkering with spare parts and stuff like that. She also created some custom prosthetics that like gave her a greater range of motion and control that she used to improve her art. In 2009, she displayed some of her art in Ventura County, California, and this was part of an event that was held for National Crime Victims' Rights Week. Mary said, quote, "I would never have been able to turn from victim to survivor without advocates and attorneys. I will never get over being attacked. I wake up every morning with a constant reminder, but I can move past it." She did also have an art show in Seattle, and I read that she also drew family portraits on commission, like working from photographs. I'm not sure if she still currently does that, but at one point she did. So that was a little bit about how Mary dealt with the after effects of what happened to her. Let's get back to the POS Larry. All right. So Larry, after only serving 8 years and 4 months of his piddly 14-year sentence, he was paroled on, quote, "good behavior" in April of 1987. And his time behind bars was described as actually, quote, boring for him. After this is a guy that like was been in the military, and so after like the order of like the military and stuff, it is said that prison was no big thing for Larry. And Larry had earned time off of his sentence by serving as like a teacher's assistant in a prison classroom. And this cut his already pathetic 14-year sentence even more. It should be noted though. So even though he had, quote, "good behavior," it should be noted that before he was released from prison, his psychological evaluation read, quote, "because he is so out of touch with his hostility and anger, he remains an elevated threat to others' safety inside and outside prison." Additionally, while he had been in prison, Larry had written threatening letters to Mary's lawyer, threatening Mary and promising to finish the job. Now, during his short time in prison, Larry tried to appeal his conviction, and he even did an interview with a newspaper behind bars. He maintained that it was Hitchhiker Larry and Pedro who had attacked Mary, who he said now it wasn't, quote, reefer. Now he claimed that she was smoking PCP. And he also claimed that she was a nymphomaniac who got naked. He whined and complained in the interview how he was financially destitute. He had lost all of his sailor benefits. And he claimed claimed that his daughter actually had to drop out of law school and change her name and go to business school instead because of the stigma. Yeah, that had nothing to do with anyone else but yourself, Larry. All right? That was all you garbage piece of crap. Y'all, he actually said in this interview, he was the victim. He was the victim. He said that he had been framed, that the cops had planted the hatchet in his toolbox, and that the real reason why he washed the van's carpets and floor mats was, Deborah had hauled some feed for her ponies, and so he had to wash it out because it was all, like, stinky and dirty. Okay, Larry. Now, when the scumbag was paroled, it, rightfully so, caused a national outrage. People were pissed. Many thought that the time Larry served was not adequate. You think? There was anger about the lax sentencing laws that there were for sexual crimes and crimes that involved torture. Particularly in this case, when the victim was not only sexually assaulted and mutilated, like tortured, she was a minor on top of that. A child. And as a result of this public outcry, California passed the Singleton Bill. And this stops the early release of offenders whose crimes involve torture. Now, the minimum sentence for such a crime, the minimum is 25 years. And I read several sources that said if Larry had been charged today with today's new laws, he would have gotten life. But this next part will probably tickle you a little bit because I quite enjoyed this next part. So, as soon as Larry was paroled, no community in the state of California would have this POS. Nobody wanted this scumbag in their community. The state of California had even asked the state of Florida, which was, Larry's home state where he had been born, if they would take him. But, the state of Florida pretty much told California to kiss their ass. They told California, nah, man, Larry's your problem. And probably because he had property in Nevada, the state of California asked the state of Nevada as well. And they pretty much told California the same thing. You can go kick rocks. That's your problem. Larry was initially paroled to Contra Costa County. Try saying that 5 times fast. But no town in this county would accept Larry's presence. They were not having it. Stanislaus County and San Diego County, they actually petitioned the courts on why Larry couldn't be released into their counties as well because authorities were trying to release him into their custody as well. And San Francisco had already taken steps to make sure that Larry wasn't released into their jurisdiction either. Nobody wanted this guy, and rightfully so. Apparently, whenever authorities attempted to settle Larry in any of these communities, angry crowds would gather, sometimes members of local biker gangs like the Guardian Angels and Hell's Angels would even show up as well. And people protested, they picketed, they screamed. People were not having it. They were very, very angry and upset. In Rodeo, a crowd of 500 had actually gathered, and they ended up forcing officers to move Larry under armed guard from the hotel that he was staying at. At one point, they tried housing Larry across from the Concord Town Hall, but that was met with protests as well. Although I actually read this was actually a ploy by authorities because they were having so much trouble trying to settle this guy that they actually put out a false story that he was over there when in actuality he was somewhere else. At one apartment he was staying at, they actually had to escort Larry with a bulletproof vest outside because 400 residents had shown up and surrounded the hotel, and they were outraged that the decision had been made to let him live there. And so, police had to get him out of the apartment with a bulletproof vest and move him again. People, of course, had signs at these protests. Some of them said, quote, drop dead Larry, quote, get the maniac out. No one wanted this creep, and rightfully so. Now, for approximately 4 weeks after he was released, Larry was just whisked from hotel room to hotel room, town to town, under armed parole guard, as the state and the courts decided, what to do with this scumbag. Larry's location was kept secret as they were figuring out what to do. Like I said, authorities were constantly moving him. They were kind of playing a game of hot potato with him. And finally, then Governor George Duke Mazion, I don't know if I just butchered that name. That was a mouthful. But apparently, the governor of California, he ordered that 60-year-old Larry be placed in the confines of a trailer on the grounds of the San Quentin State Prison. And he would stay here for the duration of his 1-year parole. Yeah, not only did he get a crap sentence to begin with. Not only did this a-hole get out early, he only had a 1-year parole. He had a curfew from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., was able to go out 2 to 3 times a week for groceries and stuff, even a movie, and this was all paid for by his disability benefits and money from his scumbag family. Now, even though Larry may have said that he may have thought he could have done this, like in an alcoholic haze, by the time he was paroled, Larry was singing a different tune. He was thinking that he was the victim. Like I said, he did that interview with People magazine. Yeah, so he thought he was the victim. He said he worked himself into a rage when he thought about how he was treated by media and by the courts, whining how he had been threatened and taunted all these years. Aw, poor widow Wary. Yeah, no sympathy from me. Yeah. Throughout his whole time in prison, Larry honestly believed that he was the victim and he had been unjustly locked up for 8 years. What do you do with these people, man? And get this. If your blood wasn't already boiling, get this. Larry actually tried to file a civil complaint against Mary, against the woman that he assaulted and mutilated. He charged her with, quote, forcible kidnap for the purposes of robbery. Larry said, quote, I have compassion for the girl. And he said that when he came time to the decision to file his complaint, he, quote, almost vomited 3 times. And I couldn't sleep for several nights. He said that he only filed the complaint because it was the only way to clear his name, guys, okay? Remember, poor Larry's the victim here, guys. He now claimed that Mary was a sex worker who threatened to kidnap him, who threatened and kidnapped him after he was nice enough to give her a ride. The delusion of some of these people, man. He then said that she tried to maim and kill him. Thankfully, the courts dismissed this case for lack of standing. Yeah, they immediately threw it out. What a scumbag. Now, as soon as Larry had been released from prison, Mary left Gig Harbor, and she drifted around, never staying in one place too long. Because remember, guys, he had threatened that he was going to finish the job, and now he was out and free, and she was scared. Mary hired a series of bodyguards. She was that scared, and at one point, she ended up living in an abandoned gas station in Tacoma, Washington. She constantly had night terrors and nightmares, and these nightmares were so intense that they jolted her awake, and they jolted her awake with such violence and force that she cracked her own ribs several times, smashed her own nose, and even dislocated her shoulder because she would wake up with such a violent start. Can you imagine? But no, yeah, Larry's the real victim here. Mary tried to complain to police that she had received threats from Larry. But get this. The scumbag pigs did not take her seriously and said, oh, well, Larry's kind of too old to do anything now, so you just need to calm down. Excuse me, he was an old fart when he picked her up. That's why she got into the van, because he looked like an elderly grandpa. And now you're telling her that he's too old? Ugh, the rage I feel with this case. Now, one of the bodyguards that Mary had hired, his name was Bob Clayton, and he said that his team had received word that Larry was actually getting paid speaking fees by a bunch of racist militia groups. Larry was apparently he was racist, but apparently he was very anti-Asian and anti-black for some reason. Apparently those were the two groups he really hated. And when you mix in the fact that Mary is half Filipino, Mary's fears were very much alive that Larry was going to come back and hunt her down and finish the job. Bob said that he did believe Larry stalked Mary after he was released, but there was no proof found that this happened. Meanwhile, Larry was finally forced to leave the state of California as, no one in the state wanted his ass. He was much too famous, and so when his 1-year parole was over, in 1988, Larry hightailed it back to his native Florida. He ended up settling in Orient Park neighborhood in East Tampa, and he went by the name Bill Johnson. And most of his siblings lived here as well. Now, at first, Larry received the same welcome that he did in California. He at first alternated between living with his brother and sister, specifically his brother Walter. But as soon as locals found out who Larry was, their homes were the targets for vigilantes. His brother's home was the target of a firebomb. I guess this was was tossed in his yard, and his sister's home had been shot up with BB guns. A local car dealer offered Larry $5,000 if he would just go away, and Larry also briefly lived in a mobile home behind his niece's house, but she ended up kicking him out when he refused to stop drinking. And I'm sorry, I gotta say, any of my family or friends were convicted and did the things that Larry did, you can go F off and die for all I care. I ain't letting you stay with me. And in 1990 and 1991, Larry was arrested 3 different times for shoplifting. And he told the court he was a, quote, confused, befuddled old man. He was sentenced to 6 months in April of 1990, and this was for petty theft. He had stolen a disposable camera from like a drugstore, but he only served 60 days of that. In November of that same year, he was arrested for shoplifting again. This time, he shoplifted a hat from Walmart and was sentenced to the maximum 2 years. Now, I read some sources that said he served the full term, while others said that he only served 48 days. And every one of these little brushes with the law, protesters, of course, showed up. Eventually, Larry ended up settling into his childhood neighborhood, and he ended up settling on a home on a lot that was actually 3 blocks from his childhood home. His brother Herb bought him a single-story wooden home. I actually read it was like an abandoned barracks, and over the course of 6 months, Larry, who was now going by Bill Singleton, had turned this property into like a newly renovated home. He had a manicured lawn, new carpet, a $10,000 kitchen with a built-in microwave, $9,000 worth of cherry wood furniture, new couches, all courtesy of a scumbag brother. Yeah, Mary had to file bankruptcy. Meanwhile, this POS just gets to live it up. Just gets to live it up. Makes me so angry. And yeah, Larry just settled into his new life. He had a dog and a cat. He played in a Monday afternoon bowling league. Although I did read some sources that said that, like, I guess the bowlers on that team wouldn't really let Larry, like, play with them because they knew who he was. So unclear if he had a bowling team or not, but he still went bowling. And as when he'd bowl, he'd stop by the snack bar for a midday beer, because that's what you need, right, Larry? And I actually read that he actually went on a month-long bender the first month in his new home. His brothers, Herb, Walter, and Jimmy, they would stop by with their wives. And yeah, Larry was just able to live it up. He lived off his Social Security. And then I read that he did have a pension from his years as a merchant marine, but then I had read like the other source that said that like he lost his benefits, so a little like unclear. But the thing that you should take away is that Larry here was all settled. He had money coming in. Mary, meanwhile, she's destitute, living in abandoned gas stations for fear of her life. Meanwhile, this scumbag gets to live it up. It makes me so angry. And over the years, Larry managed to ingratiate himself to his other elderly neighbors and the other families and the other neighbors in the whole neighborhood that he lived at. And yeah, they thought of Bill as just like a nice guy. He brought steaks over for neighbors, allowed children to play with his dog, which was a Rottweiler puppy named Kala. I read other sources that said it was Kayla, but who cares? He wiped his cat's paw prints off of his neighbors' cars. And yeah, he was just that good old, just that innocent old man neighbor. That was the persona he was able to project. Now, some heard that he did have a past in California, but they believed his other Larry BS story and actually started to believe this nonsense about him being framed. Now, at first, because some neighbors, they were aware of who Larry was and what he had done, and it is said that, like, mothers, they kept a closer eye on their children, husbands kept a closer eye on their families. But over time, yeah, just through these little, like, seemingly good deeds and stuff that I just listed, they began to believe that maybe Larry was indeed framed. He's such a nice old guy. How could he do that? One neighbor named Tom Bennett, he said that though they were scared of him at first, over time and through his generous gestures, he, quote, was the neighbor you dreamed of. I started to believe him. Maybe he was framed. Other neighbors? They weren't even aware of his criminal past. On February 1st, 1997, 69-year-old Larry, he attempted suicide in full public view of his neighbors. He attached a dryer hose to the exhaust pipe of his van and, got inside. Now, his neighbors, David and Melissa Sales, I'm gonna assume that's how you say their last name, that's how it's spelled, they watched this and, immediately got him out. They literally saw him do this, and when they got inside, he was like, whoa, what the heck, and they got him out. Larry went back inside his home, and an hour later, while David and Melissa Also inside their home, Larry repeated this process, but this time he managed to be in the vehicle for 40 minutes before David and Melissa noticed. Larry had been arrested that same day earlier, again, for shoplifting. This time he had stolen a drill at Sears, and he had been released that same day. After he had got home, that's when he had tried to commit suicide. He had left a suicide note on his kitchen table, and it was addressed to his family, and it said, quote, "I hope that I find peace. I would like to thank everyone who helped me, especially her. Please have me cremated and have my ashes thrown into the Palm River on the outgoing tide." He was briefly committed to St. Joseph's Psychiatric Care Center, and his family and friends hoped that doctors would keep him there, confined involuntary under the Baker Act, which was a Florida state law that pretty much allowed, loved ones or whatever to involuntary commit someone who they thought was, a threat to themselves or others. Now, a hearing was set for February 13th. But on February 10th, Larry signed himself out of St. Joseph's. And because they hadn't had their court hearing yet, to see if they could instill the Baker Act on him, Larry was free to just go. St. Joseph's couldn't keep him there. And for some reason, his hearing for the 13th was canceled. And 9 days later, on February 19th, he would encounter 31-year-old Roxy Leah Hayes. Roxy was born January 10th, 1966 in Tampa, Florida. She was described as being bright, witty, and unapologetically honest. She was the youngest of 5 children, and she had a sister and 2 brothers. That's all I read was youngest of 5 children, a sister and 2 brothers. So I don't know if she had 2 sisters and 2 brothers or what. That's just what the newspaper article said. Now, Roxy, she was sexually abused by her grandfather starting at just 2 years old. Apparently this was a pretty open family secret, but no one did anything to protect Roxy. And when she was about 6 or 7, her grandfather actually died, and Roxy was actually in the same room as him. I'm unclear if he was assaulting her or not when he died. Her father was described as being an abusive alcoholic who often beat Roxy, and when she was 14 years old, her mother, who was a bartender, she had died, and that's when Roxy decided to run away from home and leave for good. She stayed with family and friends and did manage to graduate Hillsborough High School, and she graduated in 1984. Her school experience was not one that she wanted to repeat. She said she didn't really have any friends and she felt really awkward. And this was because Roxy was 6 feet tall, 380 pounds. And she said that, she was just a loner. No one wanted to be friends with her. She said at dances, no one wanted to dance with her. At parties, no one would come up and talk to her. It's just so sad. After high school, Roxy got involved with a string of men who used and abused her, one of whom fathered her first child, her only daughter, who she named Akina. Roxy did develop a cocaine habit at some point, and she ended up dropping over 200 pounds. In June of 1986, she actually pled guilty to a cocaine possession charge, and she was sentenced to 4 years probation. But she violated her probation when she was arrested for her first charge of solicitation, and this was in April of 1987. She was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest, which she then violated when she was arrested on another solicitation charge in December, and this time she'd been sentenced to 18 months in prison. When she was released in May of 1988, Akina was now 3 years old, and the $6,000 to $7,000 that Roxy had, she had gotten it from when her mom died, had been stolen from her scumbag boyfriend. Roxy did try to get other work besides being a sex worker. One man who was aware of her background actually hired her to be a bookkeeper, but really didn't take long for him to start making the moves on her and start sexually harassing her, and so Roxy quit. She applied to other jobs, mostly fast food, but because she had no experience, no one would hire her. And so Roxy continued doing sex work. And over the next decade, this type of arrest pattern that I just recounted for you would repeat itself. Roxy met her common law husband, Clifford Tyson, in 1988. This is while she was working her corner. He was a John. He was 9 years older, and he had his own baggage. He was a Florida A&M University dropout, and he ended up in prison for robbery, burglary, and grand theft. He was released in early of 1987, and he had served about half of his 4.5-year sentence. So she came across Clifford and she asked for a ride because she was, quote, sleepy, and so he drove her around, while she slept in the back seat, and they talked a little. She told him about her daughter and her life, and Clifford actually drove Roxy to his sister's house where she would end up staying for 2 days. And after that, the couple just continued hitting it off, and they were just kind of together after that point. And it wasn't long before they were living together, and they had been together for 9 years. They ended up having 2 sons together, 7-year-old Clifton, who was born in 1989, and 3-year-old Malachi, who was born in 1993. But Roxy's run-ins with the law didn't stop just because she had a family. She was actually serving a jail sentence, again for solicitation, when she had gone into labor with Clifton, and when she had gone into labor with Malachi, Clifford had to actually call her probation officer because at the time she was on house arrest and she had to have her probation officer's permission to leave the house at all, regardless if she was in labor or not. And then Akina, who was 11, she lived with them as well. And Clifford, treated her as if she was his own. Now, Clifford, who in the past had been a cook and a chef, he became a truck driver for a carpet and flooring company, but he had been disabled in a car crash in July of 1996, and it left his knee needing really bad surgery. And this left Roxy the sole breadwinner. Now, her profession did cause a little bit of strain in the relationship, because this isn't really what Roxy wanted to do, but she couldn't find anything else, and she knew she had to support her family. Clifford would say, quote, every night she'd say, I hate this, but if we needed a meal or to wash some clothes, she did it. In fact, that was the one thing that Roxy was known for doing whatever she had to in order to support her children. It was the only reason that she was even doing sex work. And she loved her children. She read to them, dressed up with them on Halloween, took them to Celebration Station, gave them birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese. And even when it meant that she had to do sex work, which she didn't want to do, which that is sad. Like, that's what we need to get to in the society where if you want to do sex work, you should. That's a legitimate profession. I think we all sell our bodies when it comes to labor, so I don't understand why sex work gets treated with such pearl clutching. But it's sad when women are, or people rather, men and women, are forced into sex work because they have no other options. That's what really sucks. She was described as just being a very supportive parent. It is said that she never missed one of Akina's school performances. And Roxy, she worked at the same park bench on Hillsborough Avenue, and she worked there every day while her kids were at school. And she was very upfront and honest with what she did. She didn't try to hide it. When the other girls would ask her what she had spent her money on, she would always say, quote, rent and diapers. She always made her customers practice safe sex. And yeah, just did whatever she had to for her children. Some of the other girls who worked with Roxy, they described her as like, yeah, this was just a job for her. She worked alone without a pimp, didn't socialize with the other girls, didn't hang out with them, even though she was friendly with them, She very much kept her sex life work separate from her family work. Like, it was just a job for her. She didn't talk to any of the other sex workers, didn't make friendships with them or anything like that, though she was friendly, and she would do her thing and go home. And she also preferred to work in the daytime as well while her children were at school. She would park her car at a restaurant nearby and walk to the Heartline bus stop number 34. She'd sit on the bench and she would wait. And everyone knew that that was like her corner / like territory. Everybody knew. One of the girls that she worked with said, quote, everybody knew that was her corner. I've been here since 87 or 88 and Roxanne was here before me. A maid at one of the local hotels that a bunch of the girls used described Roxy as a, quote, good customer because she never left the room trashed and always like made it clean and tidy. And actually, Christmas 1996 was actually the first time Roxy was able to spend Christmas with her family because it was the first time that she wasn't sitting in jail or prison. Now, there were some who thought Clifford was actually a bad influence on Roxy because if he didn't like actively encourage her sex work, he didn't like do anything to like stop it or dissuade her. But I really don't think that like it's that black and white personally. So let's go to the date February 19th, 1997, right? Larry started his day by installing a drain pipe alongside his newly renovated home. Roxy started her day at a court hearing. She had violated her probation on a grand theft charge from 1996 because she had been charged with solicitation a few weeks earlier. At around 4 p.m., Roxy left her home to go grocery shopping. And there are some who think that she actually was going to her corner, not to the grocery store. Meanwhile, drunk, depressed, and drugged up Larry, he was lonely, and at some point, he drove down Roxy's street. He was in his white van, he saw her and he pulled over. The two agreed for him to pay her for sex, and for some reason, Larry wanted to go to his house. because it was nearby. Now, since Roxy had been with Larry twice before, and he looked like a grandpa, Roxy agreed. She didn't feel like she was in danger, and she agreed to go to his residence. The two agreed for $20 for sex, plus $10 for cab fare. Larry said that he cooked dinner, the two had sex, but that afterward, Roxy was demanding more money. Now, we don't really know what happened to cause Larry's outburst. All we know is Larry ended up stabbing Roxanne 6 to 7 times. And he stabbed her in the face, chest, and stomach, and he stabbed her with a boning knife. One of the stab wounds actually penetrated her heart and liver. Later that evening, around 5:45, 5:50 p.m., a painter who had done/continued doing some work for Larry, his name was Paul Hitson, he returned to Larry's house unannounced because he wanted to touch up the carport that he had painted for Larry. He was with his uncle, and as the two walked up to Larry's house, they saw a horrifying sight through an open window. Larry was stark naked in his living room, straddling and beating a nude woman on the couch, and she was crying for help. Now, Paul ran and got a shovel, but his uncle stopped him, and they both went to the front door to get a better look. Like, I think his uncle was like, whoa, let's get a better look. Like, what's going on here? So they go to the front door and peer through another open window, and they saw the scene. So Paul kicked at the window, and Larry looked up with this like glassy stare, and he told the woman that he was hitting, stabbing, and whatnot, who was Roxy, to, quote, shut up. Paul made eye contact with Larry, and Paul described Larry's gaze as, quote, being in another dimension. I read other sources that said Paul would later describe to police that he heard, quote, bones crunching, like chicken bones breaking. And Larry, after making this brief eye contact with Paul, went back to pounding/stabbing/beating Roxy. And they actually couldn't see exactly what Larry was doing. They just saw him raising his arm up and down, and police theorized that they were witnessing not Larry pummeling Roxanne, but stabbing her. And that's when Paul and his uncle left to go find a payphone that they could call 911. Their call came in at 6:07 p.m. The two waited about 5 minutes and then returned to Larry's house. Still no cop car. So they left again, drove around for another 10 to 15 minutes, returned to Larry's house. Still no cop car. So that's when they drove back to Paul's house and called one of Larry's relatives. And they then returned to Larry's house, where finally a police car was present. When the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Deputy Raphael Morphe, when he arrived at Larry's home, 32 minutes after Paul had called 911, other sources said that it was 34 minutes, he met Larry at the entrance of his home, or of the carport, excuse me, not his home. Now, according to Officer Morphe, I hope that's how you say his name, by the way, Larry was wearing an open shirt that was bloody, shorts with his genitals hanging out, and his hand was cut. He told the officer they had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend, but that everything was okay now, and that he didn't need to be there. He appeared nervous, and he said that he cut his hand cutting radishes. Or excuse me, he said he was cutting turnips, not radishes. And that's when the phone rang. And when Larry stepped inside his home to answer it, leaving the door open, that's when the officer peered inside the door and saw Roxy's mutilated, dead body. And next to her was a length of rope. I read another source that actually said when the officer showed up to Larry's home, that Kala, his dog, was barking, and he was hesitant to go up, and that's when a neighbor of Larry saw all this and came over and calmed the puppy down and tied her up, and the two men then knocked on Larry's door. And when he answered, he was naked, covered in blood, and wearing a condom still. And he seemed dazed and incoherent, like as if he were drunk, and then that's when the phone rang. So, yeah, not quite sure the exact chain of events that led to the officer peering inside Larry's home and seeing Roxy's body, but those were the two different stories that I could suss out from various sources. As Larry was being led away in handcuffs, he said, quote, "They framed me the first time, but this time I did it." However, by the time Larry was granted a public defender, he was changing his tune, and he was planning to plead not guilty. What a shock, right? Larry not taking responsibility for his actions? Shocker. Now, the police department was heavily criticized for how long it took them to respond to Paul's 911 call, and the police claimed that the reason for the long response time, it was just a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was shift change, there was really heavy traffic, and that was why. It was just a series of unfortunate coincidences. But there were others who theorized that it took them so long because this neighborhood that Larry lived in, although it wasn't like crime-ridden, it was sort of like little lower on the socioeconomic status, and so some people were wondering if that's why it took them so long to respond. Now, when Roxy hadn't returned by 9 p.m. that night, Clifford was worried and he did go out looking for her. He called everyone he knew, drove around all of her local haunts and spots and couldn't find anything. And finally, after not being able to find her, he reported her missing. And the next morning, when he was getting the children ready for school, he saw the news report about an unidentified woman who had been murdered at Larry's home. And remembering that Roxy had left her ID in his car, he, on a hunch, went down to the police station, and that's when he got confirmation that the unidentified victim was in fact Roxy. And at the time of her death, Roxy had 5 open court cases. Now, at Larry's trial, which began in February of 1998, Larry's defense maintained that although he did kill Roxy, it was a, quote, spontaneous burst of emotion. They were trying to say that the killing wasn't premeditated and was actually a lesser charge because they were trying to get the death penalty taken off the table because he was eligible for the death penalty. Now, his lawyers had hoped the prosecution would offer a deal of life with no parole, but they hadn't, and that's why his defense team had taken Larry's case to trial. Now, Larry took the stand in his own defense and gave his own version of events. He said he had met Roxy at a KFC, like a couple of months ago. It was the first time that he had met her. They chatted, and then he paid her $20 for oral sex. He claimed that 3 weeks later, Roxy called him up and asked if he would like her services again, which he did. And he claimed that the day he murdered Roxy, she was in a foul mood. She told him that her drugs had gone up in price, and that's why she was now demanding more money for her services. Now, cocaine was found in her system at autopsy, although the coroner did say that she could have ingested that cocaine anywhere from an hour to several days before her murder, which I didn't know. I thought cocaine was like, yeah, I thought it would like vanish from your system. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. He claimed that Roxy had reached inside his wallet, grabbed out some money, put the bills in her mouth, grabbed a kitchen knife. He said he had 2 lying on the counter for peeling potatoes, and so she grabbed one of them, kicked him in the nuts as they struggled, I guess, for possession of the knife. And in the ensuing struggle, this is what he was saying, in the ensuing struggle right there, Roxy had stabbed herself 6 times. Okay, that was his defense. She had stabbed herself 6 times. Okay. The prosecution, through pointing out like the type of stab wounds, like through their depth and angle and stuff, clearly disputed Larry's version of events. One of the stab wounds had gone through Roxy's stomach all the way to her spine, and the defensive wounds on her hands had gone all the way down to the bone. And remember that length of rope that was found next to Roxy's body? The police theory was that Larry was going to use that rope to drag Roxy's body out of the house and into his van, but that he was like just too drunk and out of it to really make much of a go of it. And then of course, Paul and his uncle stumbled upon the scene. Now, the jury wasn't buying the defense's arguments either. And on February 20th, 1998, it took them less than 3 hours, specifically 2 hours and 40 minutes, to find Larry guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. And when the sentencing phase began, where Larry faced the death penalty, Mary was flown all the way from Florida. During the trial, the prosecution was barred from bringing up what Larry had done to Mary, but in the sentencing phase, they were allowed to bring Mary, and she was allowed to tell her tale. Her testimony only lasted 10 minutes, but she identified Larry, said what he had done to her, and everyone was so wrapped up in like really heightened to hear what Mary had to say, like it was like a big deal and like a big setup, that they actually forgot to swear her in. And I read one source that said they actually had to interrupt her in the middle of her testimony to swear her in, and then I read another source that said that they waited till the end of her testimony to swear her in. In the end, it took the jury only 1 hour to recommend death for Larry, and a judge upheld the decision in April. But on December 28th, 2001, at 74 years old, Larry died of cancer while waiting on Florida's death row. Now, I'm not too sure where Mary is today. I think she resides somewhere in Washington. I read other sources that said she resided in Southern California. I know she really is like private and wants to live her life, so I didn't really try to dig or try to find, where she is today or anything. But I know that she did end up with 2 sons. So Luke, who we talked about very briefly and mentioned him. She also had another son named Alan. I believe they are both fully grown now. Now, I'm not sure what pets that she has today, but in a 2003 article that I saw with her, she had a couple of dogs, a hamster, a tank of fish, and a parrot. She really loves animals. That same article said that at the time she was dating a 21-year-old named Kurt Wright, whom she referred to as, quote, Mr. Wright. I'm not sure if they're still together or not, unclear. And Mary has gone on to describe her healing in 3 phases: victim, survivor, artist. When she divorced her first husband, husband, apparently she stayed very close to his mom, Pat Platt, who she said was more like the mother that she needed. She ended up attending the University of Las Vegas, Nevada. Not sure if she graduated, what she majored in, or anything like that. She ended up marrying another man named Tom Wilson, and he was an investigator, and this was in the late 90s. Mary had actually gotten a job clerking in the local district attorney's office in Orange County, California, and that's where the two had met. But they did end up divorcing as well. I think sometime in the early 2000s, like around 2001, 2002 or so, somewhere around there. And yeah, Mary said that she's a huge fan of Lord of the Rings and considers herself to be, quote, a hobbit at home. Totally relate with you there, girl. And yeah, she prefers to be left alone to live her life, so I didn't really dig too much into seeing what she's up to today. I think she's still doing art. I'm not quite sure, but I hope that she is living her best life the best she can. I know for a time she was trying to shop her story, trying, to get paid for it, because she was saying that, like, she didn't mind if a movie was made based on her events, but she wanted to get paid for it, and I say damn right. Frankly, I think any true crime thing, whether it be like a TV series, movie, whatever, I personally think that the victim or victims' families should be the first people paid for that. And I mean that even over investors. They should be the first ones paid. Like, this is their story, their family's story. That's just me personally. But yeah, I can't believe no one has wanted to make a movie about Mary. That was the tale of Mary Vincent, guys. Like, that's how she survived Larry Singleton. I mean, isn't that an incredible story? How could you not want to make a movie about that? So yeah, this was a case that I happened to find a book for. It's called The Mad Chopper. And yeah, they change all the names of like his wife and stuff like that in this book. So if you do read it, the names probably are going to differ from what I found. I went by the names I found in like newspaper articles that came out at the time that this was all going down. But yeah, this was a very interesting book. A lot about like Mary, Larry, and just everything. This whole case had me floored. Like, I can't believe that POS Larry got to just live this nice, comfy life, getting paid, having $10,000 furniture and a nice kitchen and stuff, while Mary was destitute and having subpar prosthetics. Like, it makes me so mad. So mad. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts about this case. Isn't this wild? Isn't that a wild tale? I can't believe she survived. Like, Mary is just an incredible, incredible woman. Like, my Lord, what an awesome, awesome human being. How could Hollywood not want to make a story about her? I don't get it. Well, I think that will do it for this week for Crime Dive. I hope you enjoyed this tale. Like, please tell me what you think. I was so floored when I found out about this case. So floored. I was like, oh my God, I definitely have to make a video about this. So yeah, until next week, I hope you stay safe out there, especially all my fellow gals in the US. It is not easy right now. It's terrible. I hope you take care of yourself out there. Remember, guys, especially now, don't be an a-hole. Don't be a D-bag. Just don't be a dick. All right? Like, it's just, we've got so much going on right now. We really just need to just be decent to each other, All right. I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.